kind of excited to talk to you about this. I guess we should start it with Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, you were not surprised.
Not even a little. No.
And you felt like this is inevitable and this is just something that was always going to happen and it's not going to just stop at Ukraine.
No, not even remotely. The Russian space is among the worst farmland in the world. And so they've never been able to generate enough income to have a road network. Everything has to be moved by rail. And their frontiers are just huge and they're open. And if you've got a force that can't maneuver itself, your only reasonable defense strategy is to be forward positioned and use geography to help you out. So you expand until you reach mountains or oceans or deserts, and then you anchor on either side of those and plug the access points. Unfortunately for Ukraine, there are 2 of those access points on the other side of Ukraine. So the Russians were always going to try to push through and retake that territory that they had controlled for most of the last 350 years. Unfortunately for them, in the 35 years since the Soviet system collapsed, the Ukrainians have developed an identity. And now they would like to be something other than a road bump.
So one of the narratives that was going around was that the reason why Russia was pushing into Ukraine is because NATO was moving their arms closer to the border of Russia.
There is something to be said for that. You just have to put it into context to really understand it. So the Russian point of view is for us to be secure, we need to expand until we reach a point where invaders cannot overwhelm us. We have to be able to plug those access points. But to give the Russians what they want, you have to sign over the future of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Belarus, Ukraine. Oh, let's go on. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all the stands. Basically, the Russians, in order to feel safe, they have to be able to occupy total populations that are twice of their own. And I'm sorry, but that's just not feasible. So, technically, the people who claim that NATO provoked this are correct. NATO can't have what it wants in Russia in order for Russia to feel safe. But for Russia to feel safe, they've got to occupy over 180 million people. And that was never part of the game.
So what do you think they anticipated was going to happen when they started the war?
Ukraine's still a flat country, and the Russians are still one of the largest militaries in the world.
And when you look at it going forward, if people didn't anticipate that the Ukrainians were going to be able to fight back as well as they have, and then you look at it going forward, like where does this go?
Well, there's 2 paths here. And the problem is we haven't seen either side fight in their full glory yet. And until we have that fight, we really can't judge.
In their full glory, like meaning?
Well, the Ukrainians are the underdog, but they're in the process of rapidly arming with more and more sophisticated equipment. And by the time we get to May, they will have been able to do a lot of deferred maintenance on the equipment they captured from the Russians, which was more equipment than they started the war with. There's nothing about this war that is unique in Russian history. The first year is always an absolute shit show. And then the Russians throw bodies at the problem until it goes away. And in half of those wars, the Russians ultimately win. So by the time we get to May and the mud season is over, we'll have a more advanced Ukrainian force fighting a much larger Russian force. And we will get our first real glimpse at how this is going to go. And we should know which way it's going to break. Now, it'll still take time. Because if the Russians are going to win, it's going to take them a year to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. And then they have to occupy the country. And that's going to kill a couple million people. Or the Russians are going to be able to completely break the logistical supply chains that allow the Russian troops to even exist, and we'll have 500,000 dead Russians, and the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians out of Crimea in the east. And then we get to talk about the next stage, because this is just the opening phase of what is going to be a multi-year and perhaps even multi-decade conflict.
Jesus.
Yeah.
How do you think it goes?
When the Russians made it clear that they were going to do a second mobilization, that seemed to have broken the logjam in a lot of countries, most notably Germany. And we now have armored vehicles up to and including some light battle tanks, the Bradleys from the United States specifically. So every time the Ukrainians have achieved a tactical breakthrough, they can only push as far as their infantry can run. Now their infantry is going to be mobile. And in a war of movement to this point, the Russians have proven that they're absolutely incompetent.
And why is that?
Part of it's graft. The guy who is the defense minister, Shoigu, he's arguably one of the least competent people on the planet, but he's a friend of Putin, and so he's been able to milk the Defense Department for everything. Best guess is that he has taken a third of the budget himself for procurement, and his flunkies have taken another third, so very little gets to the military itself.
So it's corruption.
Huge corruption. When you're using a force that can only supply by rail, you're completely dependent upon trucks for local distribution, and that's why the Ukrainians went after the trucks with the all the javelins that they got early in the war. They didn't really go after tanks. They went after the trucks, and they've destroyed roughly 2,000, maybe 2,500 of them, and that has reduced the Russian military to going back to Russia, confiscating city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans, and bringing them back to the front. And think of a Scooby-Doo van. Now fill it full of artillery shells. Every time you hit a bump, and that is their primary ammo supply system now, because the rail system into Crimea got blown up, the Kerch Bridge, and what's going into the east is all under artillery range, so they have to use truck, and they're just not very good at it. There may have been a case last year for nuking Poland and Berlin and Stockholm in order to disrupt the weapons flows into Ukraine. But after the battles of Izium and Kherson, the Ukrainians have more Russian gear now than they know what to do with. It's going to take them months to bring that all online. There's a lot of deferred maintenance that needs to be done. And so disrupting the weapons flows no longer is a critical issue because the weapons are already there. So the only scenario I can see where the Russians would seriously consider nukes is if Ukraine doesn't simply win, but decides to carry the fight across the border into Russia proper. In that scenario, where the very existence of the Russian government is threatened, that would probably change the math. But I don't find that likely without a significant shift in mindset in Washington, because we're providing them with the intelligence and most of the steps of the kill chain. Without that, the weapons are of limited usefulness, especially at long range. And the Ukrainians have no desire to rupture that relationship. So we're talking about a theoretical that is at a minimum 7 months away.
Long history of sacrifice and death, and they're accustomed to it in a way.
Oh, we can do better than that. We can make you a lot more depressed.
Okay.
So let me give you two things. Number one, the Russians are relatively casualty immune. They fight in an area where they fight with numbers. They've never been technologically advanced versus their peers. They've always just thrown bodies at it. So there has never been a conflict in Russian history where they have backed out without first losing 500,000 men. We're at about 100,000 now. We have a long way to go before the Russian military breaks.
So the Russians have lost roughly 100,000?
That's the best guess.
How many Ukrainians have been lost?
Probably about a third of that. But that is a third in terms of military forces. In terms of civilians, we really don't know. It could be as much as 250,000 at this point. We just don't know. German radio intercepts told us as far back as May that there were at least 70 places behind Russian lines that had suffered massacres like Bucha. And when we've had additional liberation since then, it corroborates that general assessment. Well, so that's piece one that you can be a little depressed about. The piece two, the Russians see this as an existential fight for their survival. They feel if they don't get those blocking positions, they're doomed. And they're probably right. But we now know that the Russians are fighting so badly. They're doing much worse than the Iraqis did in 1992.
Really?
Oh, yeah. If we had a direct fight now between NATO and Russia, it would be 1,001 casualties. And I don't know anyone at the Defense Department who's happy about that. Because if the Russians see this as an existential conflict, and they know they can't hold a match to NATO, then nukes are their only option. The primary reason why everyone in the West has gotten shoulder to shoulder on this is they know that if Ukraine falls and Poland's next, there will be a direct fight, the Russians will lose, and then there will be a general nuclear exchange. So there's plenty of really solid reasons to root for the Ukrainians on this one.
Jesus Christ. For Russia, I mean, if it seems like they're completely committed to this.
They are.
And if they don't win it,
the Russian state will be turning the lights off sometime between 2050 and 2070 anyway. They've had a series of big melon scoops out of their birth rate throughout the history. World War I, World War II, the collectivizations under Stalin, Brezhnev's mismanagement, Khrushchev's mismanagement, the post-Cold War collapse. And a lot of these stack on top of each other. And the biggest one stacked on top of the post-Cold War collapse. So there are more Russians in their 50s than their 40s and their 30s and their 20s and teens, which means that there aren't enough Russians that have been born in the last 30 years to carry the ethnicity forward much farther. And so they're thinking if they can forward position their military and plug those gaps now with their last generation of young people.
Have they really thought about this in that term?
Yeah, this one way or another, this is the end of Russia. The question is whether it dies in the long term on their terms or in the shorter term when they're completely unmoored. Because if they fail to secure those borders, then they've got a 2,000-mile open border with countries they consider to be hostile, and they have no way of moving troops around in a way that would allow them to defend it. From my point of view, not only did the war always have to happen, it always had to happen by now.
Jesus. Now, is this just because of the nature of a dictatorship that's run by someone like Putin, that it's just completely mismanaged because he's just dominated the power structure and made sure that everybody falls in line with his ideology and his reign? Like, what caused all this to be so poorly managed?
Well, Russia has always been poorly managed and authoritarian. But under Putin, it's taken a much darker turn because of the nature of the end of the Cold War. If you remember back to 1982, there was a coup in the Soviet Union. And Chernomyrdin and Andropov and Gorbachev were FSB, well, then KGB agents who basically overthrew the old system of Brezhnev and took over and because they were the only ones who really had a full understanding of what was going on. They controlled the information. They were not able to save the system, and so it broke. And we're now in an environment that between the terminal demographic structure of the Soviet/Russian system and Putin's personal paranoia, so he's gone through and purged what was left of the KGB, FSB, of anyone who has personal ambitions to succeed him. We're left with an entire political elite of only about 130 people. And Putin has removed anyone who has leadership ambitions.
Oh, geez.
Now, they all see the world the same way. They all kind of agree with Putin on what's at stake here. But it does mean that when this generation is gone, this is it. This is all the leadership talent that the country has.
He's eliminated all the possibility of future leaders in some way.
Even if Russia did have a replacement generation coming up, and it doesn't, he's taken steps to make sure that they can't challenge him. And so any sort of leadership talent has left or been killed.
What did they hope happens? And when everything's going so poorly, like, what do we know about how they're assessing things?
Well, they're obviously not thrilled with the way the things are. They're using one bit of propaganda after another to justify it, saying that, we're fighting all of NATO, or demons are involved. That was my personal favorite.
Demons?
Oh, yeah. When it came to the Kherson offensive and it became clear that there was more going on than just NATO weapons, the Ukrainians actually knew what they were doing. They changed the line from that these are all Nazis to these are actually gay demons.
Gay?
Gay demons, yes.
What?
Yeah, Russian propaganda is a hoot.
Please explain the gay demons.
Oh, I don't know if I can explain it. I'm just saying that this is the official line right now, is that we have
But
homosexual demons fighting us in Ukraine.
But why gay demons?
Well,
is there a mythology to that?
Not really. The guy who's in charge of the Orthodox Church is a Putin crony. Kirill is his name. He's kind of like the Eastern Orthodox Pope, if you will. And he has been a partner with organized crime and with Putin since the beginning. How can I say this without pissing off half of the people listening?
Gay demons.
Yes, and they ran with it. So that's on state propaganda now.
Really?
Yeah, it's wild.
Wow. And what's the epicenter of the gay demons?
Oh, Kiev, obviously.
Kiev.
Yeah, so we've got a Jewish Nazi gay demon.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
truth is always weirder than fiction.
And the scary rumor is that Putin has cancer. And that,
And that's kind of a classic too many steroids in your system.
Shirtless on a horseback.
Yeah, I know. You got to look at it from the Russian point of view. I mean, the standards are a little different.
Are they?
Oh, yeah. And he's got the shakes. That's one of the reasons why the Parkinson's analysis, I guess, has come out.
Boy, he does look puffy.
Yeah. Now, whether or not he's actually sick or not, I have no idea.
Could it just be that he's just drinking a lot?
Technically, he says he's a teetotaler, which is pretty rare in Russian society. But he's still alive, and a lot of Russians make it to his age.
How old is he now?
Mid-60s.